Hello and welcome back to Honors Biology. So today we're going to start talking about cellular respiration, and we're going to kind of kick this whole respiration thing off just by going over what it is, the parts of it, all the different stages of it. All right. So cellular respiration, there are a lot of steps involved in different stages depending on what type of respiration we're talking about. So don't be afraid to pause the video, take it slow, rewatch it, all the things you usually do. But don't be afraid to do it kind of extra with this video. So first, let's just talk about just what cellular respiration is. In essence, cellular respiration takes the glucose that we get from eating food or carbohydrate, right? Takes our food, and then it turns that into our ATP. Remember how we talked about how ADP recharges into ATP? This is how it does that in the presence of glucose, or glucose in the presence of oxygen will turn into carbon dioxide, water, and then our ATP energy. And some of this kind of makes sense. We intake glucose, right? We eat glucose, we eat food, basically. Oxygen, that's what we breathe in. We breathe in oxygen. These kind of combine and react together, and we get carbon dioxide. That's what we breathe out. We get water, so water is a byproduct of this reaction, and then our main thing is we get energy. So it's important that you know this reaction and this equation, because when we get to talking about photosynthesis, there's a lot of similarities between this and photosynthesis. So that's what cellular respiration is. So let's kind of break it down a little bit more now. So all cells, including plants, so we're talking prokaryotic bacteria, yeast cells, our cells, every cell uses respiration to recharge their ATP, right? They have this ADP, they recharge it into ATP. In essence, respiration uses oxygen to break down a sugar. In most cases it's glucose, but it can be any monosaccharide. And in doing so, by using oxygen to break down the sugar, it releases CO2, carbon dioxide, and water as waste products. Remember that our main goal here is that ATP. There's two different types of respiration. There's aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is respiration in the presence of oxygen. It takes place in the cytoplasm, which is like the jelly-filled liquid kind of just in the cell, in the mitochondria. And aerobic respiration will create around 36 ATP. Anaerobic respiration is respiration without oxygen present. So it's respiration without oxygen. It takes place in the cytoplasm only and creates only 2 ATP. We usually call this process fermentation. So aerobic respiration and then anaerobic respiration. And we'll talk about each of them separately. So first, let's talk about aerobic respiration. So there's 3 different stages to aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration will go through all of the stages of respiration, whereas anaerobic respiration will only go through the first one, just repeats the first stage. So the first stage is called glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, and what we're doing is that's where that glucose gets broken in half. So it gets broken in half into 2 pyruvic acids, and it makes 2 ATP doing this. And glycolysis doesn't need oxygen to work, it just does it by itself. So that's why anaerobic just repeats that first stage, because it doesn't need oxygen. Glycolysis does not need oxygen. Then stage 2 and 3 occur in the mitochondria, and this requires oxygen. So the Krebs cycle occurs in the middle of the mitochondria. We call it the matrix of the mitochondria. And what that does, the Krebs cycle, is it finishes the job to turn glucose into carbon dioxide, and it releases energy. Again, we get some more ATP from that. And then the last part of this is the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain occurs in the mitochondria membrane, and this uses that ATP from stage 1 and 2 to kind of put the finishing touches on our last 32, 34 ATP. All right, so our three stages: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and our electron transport chain. The Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain requires oxygen, glycolysis does not. So let's look at some ATP totals. So this is just that overview of cellular respiration. Let's go. We have glucose comes in. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, so outside of the mitochondria. Glucose gets turned into two pyruvic acids. The pyruvic acids then go into the mitochondria, runs through the Krebs cycle, and then after running through the Krebs cycle, the energy that's released goes through the electron transport chain and puts our finishing touches on our ATP. So let's look more at these ATP totals. So up to this point, if you look at glycolysis, I said glycolysis makes 2 ATP. That's not quite accurate. And the reason why is because glycolysis actually makes 4 ATP. So the gross production of ATP is 4. But to break glucose apart, to break glucose into the two pyruvic acids, it actually needs to use 2 ATP. So it uses 2 ATP to turn glucose into 2 pyruvic acid. So we talk about then the net production of ATP is 2 ATP. Throughout this whole process, every step of the way, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain all use ATP. But we just talk about the net totals. What do we get at the end? What's our net output of ATP? So make sure you're aware of that. So let's talk about the ATP totals. So the first step is with glycolysis. So glycolysis only makes 2 ATP. Remember, that's the net production. It's 2 net production of ATP. If oxygen's present, we go through aerobic respiration, which is glycolysis to the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. This makes around 36 to 38 ATP total between all three stages. We say 36 to 38 because each of these reactions in moving the glucose and the pyruvic acids and all of these little things, moving them takes energy. And some of that energy then is lost to heat to help us maintain body temperature, to move water out of the way. So in total, in the end, we get 36 to 38 ATP for every 1 glucose. And it just depends on, how much energy is lost throughout this process. So at the end of aerobic respiration, we get around 36. So that's okay. So that's aerobic or respiration right there. So what about anaerobic respiration? What's with this? If we don't have oxygen, what happens? If we don't have oxygen, we just repeat glycolysis. Now, as glycolysis only produces 2 ATP, though, it's not very efficient, but it can happen very quickly to the point where it's producing thousands of ATPs every second. So glycolysis works very quickly. So even though it's not super efficient, it's a super fast process. So when we talk about fermentation, so no oxygen, so glycolysis, super quick, it's a quick process. After glycolysis, remember, if oxygen is present, we move into the mitochondria for stage 2 and 3. We already talked about, the total output for the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. But what if we don't have oxygen present? Remember, we just then repeat glycolysis. That's called fermentation. And there's two types of fermentation. There's alcoholic fermentation, which is used by yeast to produce alcohol and CO2. That's why um, people who make alcohol, they'll add like barley or rye or wheat, to the vats of yeast, and the yeast will break down barley or rye or whatever and then turn that into alcohol and CO2 as a byproduct. So that's alcoholic fermentation that yeast does. But we ourselves will actually go through fermentation as well too. But they go through what's called lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is the same process. It's the same of just repeating glycolysis over and over and over again. But instead of producing alcohol at the end, it produces lactic acid. Lactic acid is the reason why your muscles burn when you're working out. If you're ever exercising and your muscles start burning, that's lactic acid buildup in your muscles. You're not giving your muscles enough time to go through the full ATP process, of going through the full, hey, this is of that aerobic respiration. So it's just repeating glycolysis over and over and over again. So then we get lactic acid to build up, and then that's why muscles burn. That's also why people will get cramps or like Charlie horses in their leg or their arm because of that lactic acid buildup in their muscles. So that's it. So remember, the purpose of both types of fermentation is to keep glycolysis going. As long as there's a sugar, glucose, fructose, as long as there's sugar, it will just keep going. But for our ATP totals, remember that anaerobic respiration fermentation only produces 2 ATP, whereas aerobic respiration produces 36. So in terms of production, aerobic respiration is more efficient at turning one glucose molecule into many ATPs, but anaerobic respiration is a quicker process. So there's your difference there. Aerobic respiration is more efficient in what it does, but it's slower. Anaerobic respiration is less efficient, but it's a faster process. So that's it for cell respiration. If you have questions, please let me know, and I will see you next